find it really interesting. I think I was reading last week about the results in the Bundesliga and how home advantage seems to have disappeared completely. I think they're reporting out of 21, 22 games, there's only been 3 home wins. And I think part of that is that when you go away from home, you expect it to be unfamiliar. I know you might have played at the grounds before, whereas playing at home, it's a familiar environment. You're used to what it feels like. So I think the lack of crowds makes those home venues quite alien, actually. I mean, you do have some practical advantages. Obviously, you still know the dimensions of the pitch. You're used to playing on that pitch, but the environment is very different. I think even down to little things, like when you've got a big crowd, it's generally just noise for people. Players don't normally get distracted by stuff that's happening in the crowd because it's just noise. It's loud, but lots of voices together just make noise. Whereas now it's going to be a lot quieter, so they'll hear things a lot more clearly, whether that's on the pitch, if it's comments from the side of the pitch, so that there's greater potential for those things that get said to have an impact on the player. I think there'll also be an issue for some players in terms of regulating their emotional state and their arousal level, because a number of players will feed off the environment, off the situation. So there'll be an issue for some players in getting to the right performance level. And I think the analogy to pre-season friendlies, I think, is a really important one here. The games are going to feel like pre-season friendlies, but even more so because there just won't be a crowd. It's going to be like training games. So to be able to get into the right psychological state, to be able to perform at the right level, I think it's going to be a real challenge for a lot of players.
Of course, everything they know about being in the Premier League comes with, as you mentioned, the sort of instant feedback from the crowd. It can, I guess, have a positive and a detrimental effect on performance as well. Whereas some people might not be suited by not getting that sort of adulation or that energy from the crowd. Do you think other players maybe would make them more relaxed and could help their performance?
Yeah, there's definitely players out there who don't perform well under pressure, and actually you're taking away a lot of the pressure that crushes them. So you could well find that there are players who normally perform really well who don't hit the same levels because they need that interaction with the crowd. They need that intensity. And there'll be other individuals who actually just don't cope in those situations particularly well. You're taking that out, they'll be able to play more easily and be able to show a higher level of performance than they would before. And again, these are all unknowns for managers and coaching staff. They've no idea how their players are going to respond, because for the players, that going back to training is a big unknown, because while they're back training, obviously there's rules in place in terms of what they can and can't do. I know until a couple of weeks ago they could do some training, but the club couldn't give them balls to play with. So there's all of a sudden it feels very strange because it's not what they were used to. And going back into games is going to be pretty similar as well. And I keep referring to the Bundesliga because it's one example that we've got. On the pitch, the guys are running around. It looks like football, other than they're not hugging each other when they score. Then you're looking around the pitch, everyone's got a face mask on, the substitutes are sitting at their distance apart. It looks very different. And until you're actually in that environment, you just don't know how you're going to respond to it. And it's the unknown from a psychological perspective that really induces a lot of the stress and anxiety that people experience. And normally what you do as a psychologist is work with people to kind of work through those barriers of, well, you know, what could happen? What could it be like? But this is a really new situation. So being able to do that with players, I think is really important. Otherwise, it could take clubs 3, 4, 5 games really to hit any type of performance. And obviously where we are in the season, that could be a real issue, particularly for teams down at the bottom of the league.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point you made, that if a team has a bad start to this, and suddenly with 9 games left, and I think of Bournemouth's example, which is local to both of us, if they lose 2 or 3 of their first games, you're looking sometimes for the crowd to lift you on. You're looking for some sort of external motivating factor to say, right, let's create the atmosphere today. You're going to be a massive part of it. If you have a bad start and you haven't got anything to feed off in the stadium, how much of an issue might people find that?
Yeah, and there is a line of thought that the better teams will do better, and the less skilled teams will do less well, just because you're kind of then defaulting to what's the ability of the players on the pitch, taking up those other factors out of the environment. And then you've got the pressure, the added pressure that's going to come with, you're not doing very well, but you've still got to raise your performance level, but you don't have the crowd to help you. You don't have that extra 12th man that they talk about. So I think there are going to be some real challenges if you don't get off to a good start. I also think there'll be interesting challenges for teams around motivation for mid-table clubs, because that can be a problem anyway. But you're not going to challenge for the European places. You're not in danger of relegation, and you really don't want to be there. So it could be really interesting to see how that performance goes. And obviously, no one knows how having additional substitutes is going to impact upon how the teams are going to work. And again, that could advantage teams who've got bigger squads, because you've probably got more high quality players on the bench. So again, it further advantages those bigger clubs.
How much of an impact can all this have on injury and fatigue as well? We've seen a few injuries, obviously, in the Bundesliga. Probably people will put that down to the shortened preparation time or whatever. But how about the psychology of, these behind closed door games, and how much that contributes to perception of fatigue and things during matches?
Yeah, I think it has an effect. I think there's a literal effect. So in terms of adrenaline release that you get from the crowd, you're not getting that. So it's difficult to get to maintain those performance levels for a period of time. And the emotion that you normally get, the high levels of arousals that you get from proper competitive games, that through that interaction with the crowd, and knowing that it's the importance and the feedback, that instant feedback that you get from the crowd, that will impact upon the readiness state, the psychological state of the players when they're on the pitch. So I think it could be really difficult. And then there is that increased physical risk. Lots of people are talking about it. Obviously, we've seen injuries in the Bundesliga, which then is in the back of players' minds. And then when you start thinking that there's an increased risk of injury, then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You don't consciously do it, but your behaviours change slightly. So maybe you don't go into a challenge quite as hard as you would before. You're trying to protect yourself, and those things can put you at greater risk of injury. And then there is the practical risk of burnout, because this is going to be psychologically draining for players, because they're coping with playing with football, and normally they might be fine, but you've got a finite amount of ability to cope with stuff. So the last 2 or 3 months for most people will have reduced how much stuff they can cope with. So normally people can throw stuff at you and you're fine, but because your general mental health and well-being isn't as good as it would have been, then all of a sudden your ability to cope with other stuff is decreased. So they'll be able to cope with less than they would have been able to before, at a time when things are stranger. So I think there's increased risk of actual physical injury through lack of preparation, but there could be increased risk of physical injury through behavioural changes because of some of these other things going on in their minds as well. And then also, because this is going to be draining, or more draining than it would be before, they're going to be more worn out, which then increases the risk of burnout as well. So I do think there are some serious issues. And at least it's not as bad as some of the original ideas that were put forward about the number of games that players were going to play to try and get through this, when they were talking about 2 or 3 games a week. And you're thinking, three games a week, you're going to be losing half your squad in different ways to injury. So I think it is a real challenge.
Another one that's interesting, a sort of an interesting line of thought, is the impact of behind closed doors on match officials and referees as well, because I know there have been studies that have said there's a perceived bias among officials towards home teams, and that away teams maybe get penalised more. Do you think the behind closed doors could change the situation as far as match officials is concerned?
Yeah, I also think it could change the way that players interact with match officials as well, because we all know that footballers sometimes a little bit too emotional when they engage with the match officials, and obviously they're feeding off that atmosphere that we've already talked about. So removing that, players' emotional levels are probably going to be lower, which means that they're probably going to have less emotional interactions with the match officials, which would be a positive. But similarly, the match officials will feel less pressure for a lot of their decision making. So when you've got 80,000 people who are disagreeing with the decision that you're making, and that is quite stressful. So, and as a result, I think the match officials would probably make better decisions, because again, they're not having to cope with all those other things. They should be calmer and more in control. Although again, the same issues apply for them in terms of physical injury, physical conditioning, psychological readiness, because they could react badly to the fact they're playing in in grounds where there aren't any supporters, because now we could probably name at least a couple of Premier League referees who appear to thrive off big game situations. So actually putting them in what is a training game could have a significant negative impact on them as well. So I think there could be benefits by playing behind closed doors, but it could also have a negative effect on officials.
How do you think the psychology of an away team changes going to an empty ground? So, for example, again, I use Bournemouth as the example. They've got to go to Manchester City and Manchester United. How different a psychological impact can it have going to those grounds that are empty when they're going there when they're full and at full throttle?
Yeah, I think it's an important factor for away teams. I think it's one of the reasons why in the Bundesliga away teams are doing so well, because it's an away fixture, so you know it's not home, you know it's not going to be different, but you don't have the intensity that you get from having a large partisan crowd who are after a certain result, who are trying to get on your back. So I think it should help away teams, but I also think it could be a negative for some away teams, such as Bournemouth going away to Man City, because while it is Man City, it's still a big game and players might get up for it. You have to question whether going away to somewhere like Man City against such a good group of opposition players who are not going to get carried away or are far more likely to perform to their skill level, it could be really problematic for the teams. But away fixtures should be easier perceptually for teams going away to those fixtures.
Would you expect to see more favourites winning now that sort of venues and things are taken out of it? Do you think results will be easier to predict?
Well, this is football, so yeah, never say never. But yes, I think all other things being equal, better players, better teams will perform better. And this by playing it, I mean, it'd been worse in neutral venues, but by just playing a grounds without any crowds there, I think that does advantage the better teams, because you're taking away some of the variables which would have had an impact. So big crowd getting on their back, increasing the performance level of small teams like Bournemouth. You're just taking that out of the way. So it comes back to being a game of football, and 9 times out of 10, the better team is going to win.
And how important is, I think, of what Premier League managers and coaching teams are going to be doing right now? How important will the group creating their own dynamics be in terms of, Bournemouth are in a relegation scrap? How much does their internal motivation have to be maybe that little bit higher or on point to cope with everything else that's going to be aside from their own performance?
Yeah, I think it's massively important. The idea of that group or team performance, I think particularly for teams like Bournemouth, is going to be the fundamental difference between winning and losing. I mean, Bournemouth have got good players, but they really win games when they have a really good collective team effort. And they've had a period of time, I know they'd have been engaging via video conferencing, social media, but they haven't spent a lot of time physically together. So again, they've got to reconnect to be able to play football. Obviously, they'll know each other socially, but they've got to get back into that mindset of knowing what each other do on the pitch. So being able to do that is really, really important. So playing with players that you're used to playing with becomes important. So that's where the 5 substitutes thing could be really problematic for teams who are close-knit. Because if you're used to playing the usual 11, 12, 13 players, they'll play really well. But if you make a lot of changes to that could be more of a problem compared with teams who are used to making a lot of changes, where they're better at sticking to the system and players fulfill roles within those systems. So I think particularly with increased substitutes, players being really clear what the job is of a player in a certain position on the pitch becomes crucial. So it doesn't matter who's playing in that position. Everyone knows this is the way that we play. And if you're on the pitch, this is your job. I know that is what your job is. So I know what you're going to do, which then influences what I do. So I think that becomes really important. I also think the ability of the players to motivate each other is really important as well. We talked about the absence of the crowd, which is a really good motivator and really good at increasing energy levels or arousal levels for players. You've got to try and achieve some of that in a different way. So I think the talking, the motivation on the pitch becomes important. And ideally, you want to have 11 leaders out there who are talking, who are trying to take control, who are really trying to be positive. You're not leaving it to what would usually probably be the goalkeeper and the captain, probably. So you really need to have more people who step up, who want to lead by example in those situations if you're going to be successful.